Many people in the Warhammer community insist that Sigmar, from Warhammer Fantasy Battles and Age of Sigmar respectively, is one of the Lost Primarchs. It is one thing that I see in the comments of my videos probably more than just about anything else. There is in fact a huge portion of the community that not only wants this to be true, but also absolutely insists that it is. So, in my typical fashion, I thought it was worth taking a look at this one, because it flies right in the face of everything that I believe. But that doesn't mean we can't think it over and speculate. After all, that's all 40K's Sigmarite crowd is doing themselves. So what is the evidence that this extremely popular fan theory is based in? Well, one thing really, maybe two if we're stretching it quite a bit. Okay, people who subscribe to this state that Warhammer Fantasy Battles and Warhammer 40K used to be a shared universe. And they aren't exactly wrong. There are many examples that illustrate this. The most recent I can remember is when the Albion campaign came out in 6th edition Fantasy, during 3rd edition 40K, the best edition by far. There were trophies one could earn for their warband during the campaign, and they were all Space Marine related relics such as power armor, a power sword, and a bolter, but they were described through the lens of understanding someone in the old world might have. But folks who subscribe to this really take it all the way back to 1st edition Fantasy. I started painting minis during 2nd edition, a few months before Rogue Trader dropped with the box of Skeleton Warriors, which to me is the most classic kit of all time. But I do remember Sigmar, even in that early lore, and there was nothing to make me think he was a Primarch. Sigmar was a warlord, a regular man who rose to power through brutality and united mankind. Sigmar was a barbarian who founded the most civilized empire humanity had ever conceived. Now in the old lore, there are Slann, like literally the old ones, the space toads of the Lizardmen faction, known now in Age of Sigmar as the Seraphon, and they are known in fantasy to be from space. They also hate chaos, and created the living life forms and psychic races of the old world, just as they did in the Warhammer 40K galaxy. It looks very, very likely that the various elves of fantasy are Exodites and are possibly aware of higher realms. So there are a lot of connections between the two settings. They're totally joined at the hip, somehow, but not necessarily the same universe. Now, the main piece of evidence that people use to say Sigmar is a Primarch is that when he was born, there was a twin-tailed comet seen in the sky, and well, I have a thing or two to say about this. People argue that the comet that was seen wasn't the telling of his arrival, not the holy omen it is taken to be by the barbarian tribes of the old world, but his gestation pod that he was in when the Primarchs were scattered. And well, I have to say, it isn't stated that the comet was seen falling to Earth. It's stated that it was seen foretelling his birth. He was born. He was born on the ground to parents, while the comet was in the sky where it belonged. It would have been called a meteor or something similar in old world parlance had it actually fallen to Earth. And the fact that it keeps showing up throughout the Warhammer timeline tells me that it is in fact a comet, as that's what comets do. They orbit the sun just like planets and sometimes eccentrically. So, oblong, oval-shaped orbits that can take them far away, so far away that we cannot see them, then bring them back, sometimes on long timescales. Halley's Comet is like every 80 years or so, but some comets can take hundreds of years between each time they pass us by, some possibly longer, even into the thousands of years. Okay, now onto the fact that the comet has two tails, which is made a big deal out of in the Warhammer Fantasy lore, but in reality, in the real world, all comets have two tails. We can usually only see one, but sometimes we can see both in the regular visible light spectrum. One of the comet's tails is an ion tail that always points away from the sun, blown by the solar wind. Basically, every single comet out there has two tails. Sometimes, both are visible. So that makes Sigmar's comet so much less intriguing, except it is probable that the writers didn't know this about comets when they came up with it. Just like Tatooine in Star Wars had two suns, we later found out that 60% of star systems are binary systems, and Tatooine has nothing special going on in that regard. Though, the writers were trying, especially for 1977, and the same goes for Warhammer in the 80s. They were trying. So in my opinion, the evidence that Sigmar is a Primarch is non-existent. It's a fun theory, and I like it on the surface, but there's really nothing to it. Now let's take a look at who Sigmar is, and how Warhammer 40K developed. Warhammer 40K came to be out of a simple concept. placing their fantasy setting in space, making a science fiction version of the same game with the same races and factions. Some overlap completely, like Slann and Zotes, but others are more subtle, like High Elves and Craftworld Eldar, or Wood Elves and Exodites, or Dark Elves and Drukhari. It was almost like, hey, wouldn't it be neat to play a sci-fi version of this? And this happened to be a game with orcs, goblins, minotaurs, dragons, etc. So it was pretty much a copy-paste, and even some of the early books like the Realms of Chaos books, Lost in the Dams and Slaves to Darkness, were aimed at both games, providing stats for chaos demons that could be used in both systems. But when it came to creating the lore for Warhammer 40K, they got a bit more ambitious than they did with Fantasy Battles, and they ripped off, were inspired by all the great sci-fi franchises at the time. From Star Wars to Aliens to the Terminator, Starship Troopers, Dune, etc. Warhammer was a gumbo, a hodgepodge of various components paying homage to the greats. Sure, they had space elves, space orcs, space whatevers, but it quickly developed an identity of its own, and outgrew its parent, Warhammer Fantasy Battles. So this deep lore they leaned into had to have a focal point character, and the poster boy for Warhammer Fantasy, Sigmar, in my opinion, found his way to Warhammer 40K in just such a capacity. For in the dawn of Warhammer, the Sigmarite cult rose, making a god out of their king, Sigmar the barbarian who became a warlord, who became a king, who became a god. That's exactly the same trajectory as the Emperor of Mankind had. Big E has always been Sigmar's representation in Warhammer 40K, at least as far as I understood it. I used to look at the 3rd edition 40K rulebook side by side with the 6th edition fantasy rulebook, both of which are the ultimate best editions of their respective games, and it just seemed too obvious. The legend is almost the same in so many ways. It is so much so that I honestly would put my money on Sigmar literally being the true name of the Emperor of Mankind that the King in Yellow is supposedly searching for. I doubt that they do this now, especially with the heavy-handed way they've treated separating the universes in recent years. But to me, there's just more money in it for them if there's a connection. How much more would the player base and the fans of the lore, too, feel like exploring the other side, from fantasy to 40K, or vice versa, if they knew there was familiar material for them that connected both settings? Oh, you don't know AOS, but hey, you know the Emperor, and yeah, he's a god in this system too, like Slaanesh or Tzeentch. There's nothing to my thoughts as far as concrete evidence. It was just something that I used to think was so obvious that I just took it for granted and basically believed that everyone saw it that way, because it was too glaringly obvious that they were trying to make that connection. I believe that they severed that connection with the death of the Old World during the End Times campaign. Once they blew up the Old World and Sigmar re-entered the setting with his own eponymous game, he was a god. And he was a really detached, sort of semi-evil psychopath who uses his Stormcast. Yeah, he's almost just like if Big E wasn't stuck on the Golden Throne. When we look at Sigmar in his current incarnation in the Age of Sigmar setting, he's literally a god. And just like the Alpha Legion cultist Psyker Tulava says of the Emperor of Mankind, not all beings who are gods are deserving of worship. So yeah, I think as far as I'm concerned, until Games Workshop tells me otherwise, the clues are all there for us to read. Sigmar's not one of the Lost Primarchs, not the misbegotten son of the Emperor. He is his respective setting's aspect of Big E. And there are some clues to this during the battle between the Emperor and Horus, the final battle aboard the Vengeful Spirit. In the End in the Death 3, when they're fighting across dimensions, across realities, across worlds, there was a medieval setting they fought in, as knights in armor, but totally medieval. Among the countless, nearly infinite realities that they dueled on, one that got some of the lion's share of the focus was the medieval setting. Big E was always a king, noble and fierce, a true warrior, king by his own hand kind of guy. In every aspect he assumed, he emphasized that. Where Horus took on dark aspects, such as wolves, monsters, and chaos warrior lords, even as the warp itself to some degree. The Emperor clung not just to his humanity, but to his nobility, to his kingliness. The story of light and dark plays out much the same throughout all of history, throughout all time, all realities, through infinite parallel universes and dimensions, something which is openly and heavily addressed in The End and the Death. So we can safely assume that all those realities are in fact true. They're all happening. But who folks are, what the essence of them is, seems to stay consistent no matter what parallel universe they are occupying. For wherever the fight took them, the Emperor was always righteous, and Horus was always traitorous and jealous. But the Emperor was always his most base, foundational self, who he came up as, and let's not forget just what that is. The Emperor of Mankind was the last one standing, the last of the techno-barbarians who took all comers out back behind the tool shed and tanned their hides. He won the unification wars, not through diplomacy or kindness. He won through utter violence and the will to use it. Make no mistake, techno-barbarian space king who becomes a god is way more likely to be Sigmar's 40K identity than son of techno-barbarian space king who got lost in the warp. Either way, it would be cool with me. But I don't think there is any evidence that he's a Primarch, and a ton of evidence that he, being a god and an emperor and formerly a barbarian tribesman, checks all the same boxes as Big E. And while Big E may have become a much more popular, well-known, even household name, Sigmar will always be the OG, the template from which the Space Lich who gobbles down thousands of psychers a day was crafted. For in the end, no matter what system you paint, play, game in, or read the lore of, if you are loyal to mankind, then they're your go-to guys. Despite all their faults and despite how they can both be seen as selfish and utterly evil psychopaths, at least it can be argued that they are, despite all that they are, the only being standing between humanity and a very, very hard way to go against chaos. They both do what they have to do, and they both hold their systems together. And we'll know the Emperor's true name soon enough. Pandemonium is finished, just being held back for the right moment to release it. We'll likely find out during the conclusion to the King in Yellow, Eisenhorn, Ravener whole thing. For if anything ever sounded like a word of Annuncia to me, then it would be the name Sigmar. The Heldenhammer is the only being even comparable, and is the only hero of mankind, fighting the hordes of chaos, orcs, undead, etc., since the dawn of time, during the age of myth and heroes. Look at the warrior priests of Sigmar, of the Empire of Man, and tell me that doesn't remind you of the ecclesiarchs of the Imperium. Warhammer 40K is going to turn 40 in just over 2 years, in August of 2027. Mark my words, by then we'll know the Emperor's true name, and probably a lot more about him. And my money, if I had to bet, I'd put it all on Sigmar Heldenhammer, for if anyone is the Warhammer 40K, it's the Emperor of Mankind. But Sigmar goes even deeper than that. Sigmar is the Warhammer. For if you do the simple math equation, Emperor minus current 40K setting plus medieval fantasy setting equals what? Yes, you guessed it, Sigmar. Oh, and before I go, Karl Franz is Alfarius.